Hey guys, and welcome back to History Mysteries, where I talk about interesting and little known facts covering historical happenings from ancient times through to modern history. This week, with the impending US election, I'm going to look at a few historical elections of interest, some that have shaped subsequent elections, and some of those occasions when the winning candidate did not win the popular vote. At the outset, let me be clear that winning the popular vote is when the candidate that gains the most votes may not gain 50% of the vote, such as Clinton in 96. This is known as a relative majority in the UK and a plurality vote in the US. Whilst it is common to see someone elected who didn't win a relative majority, there has also been one occasion where the person who won an absolute majority in a US presidential election didn't also become president. More on that later. To date, there have been 5 United States presidential elections in which the winning candidate did not receive a majority of the votes. 2000 and 2016 are quite recent, and since my channel has a cut-off for modern history at the Second World War, today I'm going to look at the elections in 1824, 1876 and 1888. Each of these provide details of the intrigue, politics and shenanigans that surrounded early elections and could possibly give us a flavour of future elections. To skip to a particular example, timestamps are in the description. First, for those who may not know, here are a few basics on how the system for a US presidential election works. At the heart of the system is the Electoral College. The number of electors each state has in the Electoral College is equal to the sum of the state's membership in the Senate and House of Representatives. The least a state can have is 3 electors, as many of the smaller states, such as Alaska, still have. But California now has a whopping 55 electors. There are, in 2020, 538 electors, and an absolute majority of 270 votes is required to win the election. However, the number required previously was much lower, as new states joined the Union and population grew. In modern elections, each state's electors meet in their state capital on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. In 2020, this will be on Monday, the 14th of December, to cast their votes. So if it is the electors in the Electoral College who actually vote for the president and vice president, what part does the voting undertaken by the general populace play? Well, apart from Maine and Nebraska, the winner of the plurality of the statewide vote receives all the votes for that state. So if you win Alaska, you will get 3 Electoral College votes. But if you win California, you'll get 55. The 12th Amendment now mandates that Congress should assemble in joint session to count the electoral votes and declare the winners. This session is now required to take place on January 6th, in time for the inauguration at noon on January 20th. If any person receives an absolute majority of the electoral votes, that person is declared the winner. If there is a tie, or no candidate receives a majority, then choice falls to Congress in a procedure known as a contingent election. In this scenario, each state delegation votes en bloc, each state having a single vote. A candidate must receive an absolute majority of state delegation votes, at present that would be at least 26 votes, for that candidate to become president. The House continues balloting until it elects a president. The District of Columbia does not get to vote, nor do US territories, even though DC now gets to vote in presidential elections. Since the 20th Amendment, it has been the newly elected Congress that declares the winner of the election, but in all elections before 1936, it was determined by the outgoing House. Okay, that's the background. Now first, the election of 1800. This was the 4th presidential election, but it was only the 2nd which was seriously contested, since prior to this, Washington had been elected and re-elected without opposition. 1800 was a rematch between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were then the sitting president and vice president respectively. I want to talk about it today as it shows the partisanship and shenanigans that can take place when matters proceed to a contingent election in the House. The way the election took place shows the potential flaws in the system, even if, on this occasion, the one with the most votes still became president. In 1800, the Democratic Republicans nominated a ticket consisting of Jefferson and Aaron Burr, while the Federalists nominated a ticket consisting of Adams and Charles Pinckney. The electors in the Electoral College each had 2 votes to cast for president. Whoever got the most votes would be president, and the person who came second would become vice president. Each party formed a plan in which one of their respective electors would cast a vote for a third candidate or abstain, so their preferred presidential candidate gained 1 more vote than the party's other candidate. While the Federalists successfully executed this plan, the Democratic Republicans did not, and so Jefferson and Burr tied for first place with 73 votes each. Since ballots did not distinguish between votes for president and votes for vice president, each ballot cast for Burr technically counted as a vote for him to become president, despite Jefferson clearly being his party's first choice. With the votes from the election failing to elect a clear winner, the matter fell to the House of Representatives to execute a contingent presidential election. In the 1800s, this process fell to the outgoing House, and at the time, the House was controlled by the Federalists, with a majority of 60 seats to 46 from the 16 states of the then Union. It was an ideal opportunity for the outgoing, lame duck administration to embarrass the opposition by attempting to elect Burr over Jefferson. 6 of the 8 states under Federalist control gave their single state vote to Burr. The 7 delegations controlled by Republicans all voted for Jefferson, and Georgia's sole Federalist representative also voted for Jefferson, giving him 8 states. But the victor needed 9. Vermont and Maryland were both split, and so each cast a blank vote. This deadlock continued through 35 ballots. It was only after the 36th ballot, and after 8 days, that Jefferson was elected. The Maryland and Vermont votes changed from no selection to Jefferson, giving him the votes from 10 states and the presidency. Delaware changed its vote from Burr to no selection, and the representatives from South Carolina, all Federalists, also changed their selection from Burr to abstentions. To prevent similar issues arising in the future, the 12th Amendment, proposed in 1803 and ratified in 1804, required electors to cast separate ballots for president and vice president, replacing the original system outlined in the Constitution. Originally, many states decided on their electors through a decision-making process within the state legislature, but the 1824 presidential election was the first election in American history in which the popular or public vote mattered, as 18 states chose their presidential electors by giving a vote to the people. In 1824, there were still 6 states where the decision was still being made by the state legislature. Just to be clear, the popular vote here still means that the people are electing delegates to ultimately vote on their behalf for one of the presidential candidates. They are not voting for the presidential candidate directly. However, these potential electors are pledged to certain candidates, subject to the electors not changing their minds. In the UK, it's a bit like you voting for your local councillor, and then all the councillors deciding between them who should be Prime Minister. In the run-up to the election of 1824, the Democratic Republican Party had won 6 consecutive presidential elections. The Federalist Party had waned, and so all 4 of the candidates up for selection were from the Democratic Republican Party. As no candidate secured the required number of votes, 131, from the Electoral College, this was another election that was to be decided by a contingent election in the House of Representatives. The contingent election was held on February 9, 1825, with each state having 1 vote, as determined by the wishes of the majority of each state's congressional representatives, not as directed by the popular vote. Only the top 3 candidates in the electoral vote can be candidates in a contingent election, so Henry Clay, who finished 4th, was eliminated immediately. However, as Speaker of the House, Clay still had considerable influence, and it seems that he ensured this was fully utilised. With Clay's backing, Adams narrowly won the contingent election on the first ballot, with majorities from 13 out of 24 states voting in his favour. Most of Clay's supporters, joined by several old Federalists, had switched their votes to Adams in enough states to give him the election. And so, although Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote, carried the most states, and even had the most Electoral College votes, he ended up being defeated in the contingent election. I'm sure you're wondering what Henry Clay got out of this. Well, Adams made him his Secretary of State, which was a very powerful position at the time and was then considered a stepping stone to a future presidency. While Clay never became president, he did remain a key political figure across the next 6 presidencies. The 1876 election was one of the most contentious and controversial presidential elections in American history, with the results still uncertain 2 days before the inauguration deadline. There was no question that Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York outpolled Ohio Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in the popular vote. In fact, Tilden is the only individual to have achieved an absolute majority and still not become president. So how did Rutherford B. Hayes win? The answer, once again, comes down to the workings of the Electoral College. First, a bit of background. Hayes had begun his career in Cincinnati as a criminal defense attorney and staunch abolitionist, including defending fugitive slaves in court during the antebellum years. At the start of the Civil War, he left his legal and political career behind to join the Union Army as an officer. Hayes earned a reputation for bravery and was promoted to the rank of Brevet Major General. While serving in the army, Hayes was nominated for the House of Representatives, although he refused to leave his post to campaign. After the war, he served in Congress as a Republican, where he supported the Reconstruction Amendments. Hayes then left Congress to run for governor of Ohio and was elected in 1868. In 1872, Hayes was re-elected with an increased majority, and the Republicans took control of the legislature, ensuring Ohio's ratification of these amendments to the United States Constitution, abolishing slavery and giving black men the right to vote. Hayes' success in Ohio immediately elevated him to prominence in time for the selection as the Republican presidential candidate in 1876. Samuel Jones Tilden, on the other hand, was the governor of New York. Tilden had been born into a wealthy family in New York and became a protege of Martin Van Buren, the 8th president. After studying at Yale University, Tilden began a legal career in New York City, becoming a noted corporate lawyer. Unlike many other anti-slavery Democrats, Tilden did not join the Republican Party in the 1850s. Tilden, who had prosecuted machine politicians and had sent Tammany Hall boss William M. Teed to jail, ran as a reform candidate against the background of the corruption of the Grant administration. The election took place on the 7th of November, 1876. While Tilden won the popular vote, there is still considerable controversy about how the vote had been conducted. At the time of the election, the US was still in the post-Civil War Reconstruction, which had started in 1863, and there was heightened violence across the Deep South against Republican voters, particularly poor and black voters. Election results in many states were marked by electoral fraud. The worst case was in South Carolina, where an impossible 101% of all eligible voters in the state had their votes counted. So it was against this backdrop that each of the state's electors met in December 1876 to cast their votes in the Electoral College. Tilden had won the popular vote by just over 250,000 votes, but he did not have a clear Electoral College majority. He had received 184 uncontested electoral votes, while Hayes received 165. The remaining 20 votes caused considerable controversy. In Florida, 4 votes, Louisiana 8, Oregon 1 of the 3, and South Carolina 7, 2 different slates of electors had assembled, and they cast conflicting votes. Thus, from each of these 4 states, 2 sets of returns were transmitted to Washington. which of these sets of votes were considered to be the correct slate to accept. As 185 votes constituted an Electoral College majority, Tilden needed only one of the disputed votes, while Hayes needed all 20. Initial election returns showed that Hayes had carried South Carolina by several hundred votes, but that Tilden had won Florida by 91 votes and Louisiana by over 6,000. In each of these three states, the Republicans' Hayes party controlled the bodies charged with determining the validity of the election results. In South Carolina and Louisiana, the governor recognized by the United States had signed the Republican certificates. The other from Louisiana was signed by the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, and those from South Carolina were not signed at all. The Tilden electors simply claimed they were chosen by the popular vote. The Democratic certificates from Florida were signed by the state attorney general and the incoming Democratic governor. Further complications arose in Oregon. Although both sides acknowledged that Hayes had won the state, Tilden's supporters questioned the eligibility of John Watts, a Hayes elector, as the Constitution stated that no person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Watts was a postmaster, so technically employed by the federal government. However, he resigned from his office a week after the election, before the scheduled meeting of the Electoral College. Nevertheless, the state's Democratic governor had removed Watts as an elector, replacing him with a Democrat. By January 1877, with the question still unresolved, Congress and President Grant agreed to submit the matter to a bipartisan electoral commission to determine the fate of the disputed electoral votes. Tilden opposed the creation of the Electoral Commission because he still hoped to force a contingent election. However, the Democrats had little leverage. They could delay Hayes' election, but they could not put Tilden in the White House. The commission was to be made up of 5 congressmen, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. To ensure partisan balance, there would be 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, with Justice Davis, an independent, as the 15th member. However, the Democrats in the Illinois legislature soon offered Davis a seat in the Senate. The Democrats hoped this would influence Davis, but surprisingly, or not, depending on your principles, Davis then resigned as a justice to take up the Senate seat, and hence was no longer eligible to sit on the commission. All the remaining justices eligible to take his place on the commission were Republicans, and Justice Joseph Bradley was selected to take Davis's place. The final membership of the commission were these 15 men. The Electoral Commission held its meetings in the Supreme Court chamber. It sat in the same manner as a court, hearing arguments from both Democratic and Republican lawyers. Whenever 2 different electoral vote certificates had arrived from any state, the commission was empowered to determine which return was correct. In each case, Bradley joined the other 7 Republicans in a series of party-line votes to give all 20 disputed electoral votes to Hayes, giving Hayes a 185 to 184 electoral vote victory. However, this was not the end of the matter. In those days, a presidential term began at noon on March 4th, and yet, on Thursday, March 1st, 1877, the Democrats in the House started to filibuster the electoral results. The House debated one spurious objection for about 12 hours before overruling it. Immediately, another spurious objection was raised to a different state. This filibuster would not be withdrawn until a concession could be obtained. This became the Compromise of 1877. A backroom deal was agreed between Southern Democrats and Hayes' team. Democrats would accept the Republican Hayes as president by withdrawing the filibuster, but only on the understanding that the Republicans would meet certain demands. The following are generally said to be the points of the compromise: the removal of all remaining troops from the former Confederate states. At the time, only Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. the appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes' cabinet. His Postmaster General was from Tennessee. The construction of a transcontinental railroad from Texas to the Pacific. The right to deal with blacks without Northern interference. Hayes to serve only one 4-year term as president and not to seek re-election. The House and Senate then reassembled to complete the count of the electoral votes. At 4:10 a.m. on Friday, March 2nd, Hayes and his VP Wheeler were declared elected by an electoral margin of 185 to 184. Because March 4th that year was a Sunday, Hayes took the oath of office privately on Saturday, March 3rd, before taking it publicly at the US Capitol on the Monday. He pledged to support wise, honest, and peaceful local self-government in the South. Despite his message of conciliation and the deal, many Democrats never considered Hayes' election legitimate and referred to him as his fraudulency, or simply Rutherford. Points 1 and 2 of the compromise took effect. Hayes had already announced his support for the restoration of Home Rule, which would involve federal troop removal before the election. It was also not unusual for a president then or now to select a cabinet member from the other party. As for the railroad, it was never created. Tilden himself stated, "I can retire to private life with the consciousness that I shall receive from posterity the credit of having been elected to the highest position in the gift of the people, without any of the cares and responsibilities of the office." To prevent a repetition of the farce of 1876, Congress passed the Electoral Count Act in 1887. Under this law, a state's determination of electoral disputes is normally conclusive. If a state sends multiple returns to Congress, then whichever return has been certified by the governor is counted, unless both houses of Congress decide otherwise. I wonder if similar shenanigans will come into play in the next few weeks. However, the impact of the 1876 election was more than just constitutional. Even without the conditions of the agreement, Hayes would have been hard-pressed to continue his predecessor's policies. The House of Representatives was controlled by a majority of Democrats, and even among Republicans, support for continued military reconstruction was fading. From 1890, under their new Home Rule, Southern states passed new state constitutions and laws that disenfranchised most blacks and poor whites. This resulted in Democratic takeovers of the Southern legislatures, effectively reversing Reconstruction and disenfranchising virtually all black people in the South until the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The later shift to the Republican Party, being dominant in the South, in fact followed these acts as they were introduced and signed by Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson. Whilst it is not possible to definitively conclude what the result would have been in a fair election, Hayes probably would still have won the election, with 189 electoral votes to Tilden's 180, by winning all the states he ultimately did carry, plus Mississippi, but minus Florida. It is therefore likely that Hayes would have won the popular vote in a fair election. The final election we will look at is 12 years later and a whole lot lighter. The 1888 election was held on Tuesday, November 6, 1888, when incumbent Democratic President Grover Cleveland of New York was beaten by Republican nominee Benjamin Harrison, a former senator from Indiana. Cleveland had won a plurality of the popular vote by 0.8%, but Harrison won the Electoral College by a 233 to 168 margin, largely by his 1.09% win in Cleveland's home state of New York, gaining its 36 Electoral College votes. Upon leaving the White House, First Lady Frances Cleveland is reported to have told the White House staff to take care of the building, since the Clevelands would be returning in 4 years. She proved presciently correct. Cleveland would later successfully seek a second term in the 1892 presidential election, becoming the only president in US history to serve non-consecutive terms. Similar popular vote defeats would occur in 2000 and 2016 and always remain possible under the current constitutional system. All of these elections revealed flaws in the electoral system, and often the fixes that were made have led to further flaws which have required further fixes. Is the system perfect? I'll let you decide. But the importance of the democratic process behind the election of the most powerful person in the world must never be discounted. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, let me know in the comments what other constitutional quirks you'd like me to cover, and please remember to subscribe. For some details that were cut from this video, check out the Tumblr post link below. For details on upcoming videos and shorter history facts, follow me on Instagram or Twitter, links in the description.